For most of us mere mortals, the idea of going for a balloon flight probably conjures up images like these. A colourful hot air balloon floating serenely over the African Serengeti, while a basket full of tourists snap away on their cameras and phones to capture the moment for posterity. Hot air ballooning probably wouldn't rank very highly on someone's list of dangerous activities, and for good reason. It's pretty safe most of the time. Accidents do happen, and they can be pretty bloody awful when they do, but that, I think, is a topic for another day. In today's video, we're going to be having a look at another kind of ballooning, a kind of ballooning called cluster ballooning. And if you've ever seen that Pixar movie Up, then you've seen cluster ballooning. Alright, most people don't try and fly a house underneath a bunch of balloons, but the principle is the same. Inflate a huge amount of balloons with helium, tie them together, strap something underneath, climb on, cross your fingers, cut the tether, and go for a ride. Now, for professionals, this, I'm sure, can be much more complicated than what I've just described. Street magician and showman David Blaine performed some record-breaking cluster ballooning in 2020, a feat which no doubt involved a huge team of people and probably months of preparation. Blaine apparently performed over 500 skydives and got his hot air balloon pilot certificate as part of his preparation for the stunt. And on the day, Blaine took with him bottled oxygen, a GPS, an ADS transponder, thermal clothing, and the balloons were equipped with remotely detonated squibs to safely control his ascent. Of course, the whole time Blaine was being filmed and monitored by his team. Exciting stuff, don't get me wrong, but I can't help feeling that Blaine was probably well within his comfort zone during the entire stunt. On the other hand, launching out of your backyard while sitting in a regular garden chair and equipped with not much more than some sandwiches, 2 litres of Coca-Cola, a walkie-talkie and an air pistol is probably the kind of thing that very definitely is going to get you out of your comfort zone. But who'd be mad enough to try something like that? Well, meet Larry Walters, or as he's more commonly known, Lawnchair Larry. Born in Los Angeles in 1949, Larry Walters had always wanted to fly. He recalled that as early as age 13 he'd already been struck by the idea of DIY ballooning after seeing an inflated weather balloon outside an army surplus store. His high school science project, Balloons and Hydrogen, only gained him a grade D, but that didn't matter. The urge to get up into the sky was already firmly planted in Larry's mind. To fast-track his desired career as a pilot, he signed up for the army and he served as a cook in Vietnam, but in a bitter blow, his poor eyesight excluded him from ever having any chance of flying. Returning from Vietnam, Larry got work as a truck driver, but the urge to get up into the sky wasn't diminishing. It was constantly there in the back of his mind. In 1972, he met Carol Van Dusen, who became his long-term girlfriend. Now, right off the bat, he confided to her about his dream of flight, but it wouldn't become a reality until 10 years later when Larry, in his own words, had a revelation. It's now or never. Carol, having repeatedly heard about this plan over the last 10 years, told him, just do it, just get it out of your system. So, at Carol's insistence, Larry bought a parachute for $900 and made one practice jump to make sure that at least he knew the basics of how to operate it. He then got hold of the weather balloons, 42 of them, and the helium needed to fill them. For his gondola, he would be using a regular garden chair. Not one to skimp on quality, he bought a $109 webbing and aluminium frame model from Sears and Roebuck, which he christened Inspiration 1. Other essentials procured for the flight included 8 1-gallon water bottles for ballast, a compass, an altimeter or altimeter, a walkie-talkie, a map of California, a torch, and an air pistol. The pistol was to be used to control the altitude of Inspiration 1. Larry would basically just shoot and pop some of the balloons if he needed to descend. On the evening of July the 1st, 1982, in the small yard behind Carol's house in San Pedro, Larry, Carol, and a couple of friends began filling the balloons with helium and tethering them together. As the balloons were filled, they naturally began to draw attention, as it's not an everyday sight to see a giant tower of 7-foot diameter balloons rising up from a small suburban backyard. In fact, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at the house to ask what was going on, but Larry managed to convince them that it was just part of an ad campaign that he was running. They left, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and the flight was still on. By the next morning, the balloons were filled and Inspiration 1 was loaded up and ready to go. The plan, as Larry envisaged it, was to ascend initially to about 100 feet whilst still tethered to the bumper of a friend's car which was parked in the yard. Once he confirmed that all was clear, the final tether would be cut and he would gently rise up to around 8,000 feet, and the onshore winds would carry him over South L.A. towards the desert, where he could then pop some balloons and gently land. Needless to say, that's not what happened. Once Larry was comfortably seated, the main tether was released, and Inspiration 1 shot straight up, rising at an estimated rate of around 13 feet per second. In just a few moments, the balloon chair had reached the end of the final tether and snapped it instantly. Larry was jerked forwards and almost fell out of the chair. His glasses flew off and fell to the ground. But, free of the tether, Larry and Inspiration 1 went up and up and up. His long-awaited dream of flight had finally become a reality. Back on terra firma, as Carol watched Larry disappearing into the blue yonder, she frantically pleaded with him over the walkie-talkie to cut some of the balloons and land. But Larry was having none of it. No way in heck, after all this, my life, the money we'd sunk into this thing, and just come down, no way in heck. I was going to have a good time up there. And so Larry, reclining comfortably in his Sears garden chair, continued to climb ever upwards. The higher I went, the more I could see, and it was awesome. Sitting in this little chair, I could see the orange funnels of the Queen Mary. I could see that big seaplane, the oil tanks of the naval station like little dots. I could look up the coast like forever. At one point, I caught sight of a little private plane below me. I could hear the buzz of its propeller. It was the only sound. But not everything was going to plan. Larry was being carried slowly inland, but he was now so high that he was entering one of the approach corridors to Los Angeles International Airport. Drifting along at 16,000 feet, Larry's balloon chair contraption was now being spotted by commercial airliners, like TWA Flight 231, who radioed LAX air traffic control to advise of a man in a chair attached to balloons in our 10 o'clock position, range 5 miles. One can only imagine what the air traffic controller on duty who received that call must have thought. Meanwhile, Larry, feeling a little less comfortable now in his Sears garden chair, knew that he was way too high and he was nowhere near the desert as planned. He'd been afraid to use the pellet gun, fearing that by bursting some of the balloons he would unbalance the chair, but by now he was rapidly running out of options. His feet were completely numb with cold and he was having trouble breathing in the thin air. If he kept going up, he would soon pass out, and he knew that the weather balloons were capable of ascending up to 50,000 feet. By then, he would be very, very cold and probably very, very dead. So, Larry shot out 7 of the balloons, then paused to check his altitude. But as he was doing so, a sudden gust of wind caused the chair to lurch violently, and the pistol slipped from Larry's lap. I can still see it falling, getting smaller and smaller, down towards those houses, 3 miles down, and I thought, I really hope there's no one standing down there. Larry now had no method of controlling his altitude, and it seemed as if he would have to jump and trust that he remembered how to use the parachute correctly, but some of the balloons were in fact leaking, and he realised that Inspiration 1 seemed to have levelled off at around 16,500 feet. Slowly, Larry began to descend. At 13,000 feet, he was back in radio contact, this time with the emergency services who were grilling him on what the hell was going on. What airport did you take off from? 1633 West 7th Street, San Pedro. Say again the name of the airport? Please repeat that. This is an unauthorised balloon launch. I know I'm interfering with general airspace. I'm sure my ground crew has alerted the proper authorities, but could you just call them and tell them I'm okay? As Larry continued to descend, he began to hear everyday sounds again. Car horns, radios playing, and people's voices. At around 2,000 feet, Inspiration 1 suddenly began to drop more quickly, and Larry took out his penknife and slashed open all the water bottles to empty the ballast. Still dropping, Larry clung on to the sides of the garden chair. It looked like he was going to land on somebody's rooftop, but still in urban Los Angeles, there were power lines all around. Larry eventually touched down at East 44th Way in Long Beach, scraping over the roof of a suburban house and becoming entangled in some power lines, which the police had just managed to turn off in time. The owner of the house, who happened to be a retired airline pilot, and some neighbourhood kids helped Larry down from Inspiration 1. There on the street, he happily signed autographs for bemused onlookers and even gave the firemen some of the balloons which they tied to their fire truck as they drove away. The police wanted to arrest Larry, but they couldn't find anything to charge him with, so they had to let him go. The actual chair ended up in the hands of a local lad named Jerry Flack, after Larry, on the spur of the moment, gave it to him as a present. The FAA, of course, wanted to come down hard on Larry, but he had no pilot's license to lose, and surprise, surprise, a lawn chair requires no certificate of airworthiness, so they couldn't fine him for that either. In the end, he was charged with violating airspace and fined $1,500. Larry's stunt unintentionally brought him nationwide fame. He appeared on The Tonight Show and Late Night with David Letterman, becoming known by his new nickname, Lawnchair Larry. He quit his job as a lorry driver and briefly toured the US as a motivational speaker. But eventually the fame subsided and Larry Walters went back to a normal life. For him, his flight had been a one-off, a thing he felt compelled to do regardless of the outcome. But once it was done, it was done. He had no desire to repeat it. It was something I had to do. I had this dream for 20 years, and if I hadn't done it, I think I would have ended up in the funny farm. But I wouldn't do this again for anything, not even $1 million. Later in life, Larry found solace hiking and camping in the San Gabriel Mountains, and he also worked there as a volunteer forest ranger. On the 6th of October 1993, 44-year-old Larry Walters was found dead in his tent. He died from a gunshot wound, which apparently was self-inflicted. Hazel Dunham, Larry's mother, said of him, "He put a smile on the face of America. He was proud of it, and I was proud of that too." Jerry Flack, the kid to whom Larry gave the chair, always kept it. He had it in his garage for years, still with the bottles and the tethers attached. In 2014, he donated it to the Smithsonian, and Inspiration 1 is currently on display in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.